an answer of my earliest memory would have to be, I guess it would be late 1963. I remember my mom bringing home my sister from the hospital. Not actually bringing her home, but she was a baby. And I remember coming up the basement stairs, and I remember that my mom was crying while she was ironing in the middle of the day. And I remember thinking, is the baby okay? So I went to the bassinet, the baby was fine. And I said, why are you crying? And she says, this is history. And she pointed to the TV, and I turned around, and it was John F. Kennedy's funeral procession with the horses and the coffin. And I guess that started my long history with history, because I do like history. Hippies. Not that they were really popular then, but I remember my first grade teacher was allowed to bring her boyfriend into the classroom. And I marveled at the fact that he could come barefoot. And he sat there, and we played his guitar, and we sang songs. And I mean, that's my biggest memory of first grade, is that this long-haired hippie came in and played music into our first grade classroom. And that was my introduction into what was to be in the 60s. Second grade, which was a big year for me, because it started with the space program. And Mrs. Riley, my second grade teacher, was Eugene Cernan's sister, who's a famous astronaut, one of the last men to walk on the moon. And he came to visit our school. He showed us movies of the space, the moon, the earth, and I remember thinking, look at that. I said, the earth was just so blue with these white billowy clouds, and the moon looked so dry, like a desert. And I remember that. Mrs. Riley was so proud of him. And that's probably, she introduced me into the space program. He came into Bellwood, where we lived, and did a parade. I think that was probably a little later in my life, but around the 60s. Third and fourth grade, what went on in history. I do remember Vietnam War was going on. I remember war was all over the place, TV. The guy across the street, who I believe was a distant relative on my dad's side, went to war. She hung the flag out in the window. And I honestly don't remember if he ever returned or not. But I do remember thinking how lonely she would be if he got killed, because she was all that he had, or she had. They lived alone, together alone in the house. I remember at that time too the cars. He had a jacked up Mustang, I believe, which was a big car then. And the people next door to us, the Myers, George had started a band. He would play his drums, and I guess it started my love for music, because he would sit there and I would hear the drums, and I just loved the beat. And I'd be out in the backyard on my swing set, and I could hear her. And I remember that. 60s were fun times. I saw my aunts at the house. They had a pool, learned how to swim. They were going through their own teenagehood with the war. I remember them contemplating, the boys that they knew were going or might have to go. So I remember that. The famous moonwalk, of course, happened when we were on vacation one year in '69, because it was July. But I remember hearing about it. I remember thinking about it. I was far past second grade, but I always thought of Mrs. Riley and her famous brother.
The 60s.
Oh, well, the Russians were making all kinds of threats indirectly. They were always bragging about their missiles, and then when they Kennedy ran for president, I remember I voted for him. And
One of the living Chicago voters as opposed to the dead.
yeah, yeah. And I remember when the Cuban Missile Crisis was, and I thought, oh God, no, not another war.
Oh, let's go back to the Kennedy vote. Why did you vote for Kennedy over Nixon?
Because he did, actually, he had a better way of projecting himself. Nixon would look terrible on TV. And he didn't project himself very good on TV. Where Kennedy was a shrewd speaker. He could, maybe he wasn't the greatest guy, but he was a shrewd speaker. He knew how to say what the people wanted to hear. And then he was only in his early 40s. He attracted a lot of younger voters. So. And really, how good of a president he would have been, I don't know. He wasn't in there long enough for me to really judge it. But some of the things he did was good, though.
What else do you remember was going on in the world in the 60s?
Well, I remember when he started the Peace Corps, and that was, I don't know how effective it was, but it seemed like it was pretty good. And then we'd start, when the Russians first sent up Sputnik, and all that thing was what, about a size of a basketball and a transmitter in it. And right away everybody's looking to go out, and they tell you when it's going to go over, and you'd be going out there looking. And then we sent up like a balloon. It inflated when it got up in space, and it was, I forget how many feet across. You could actually see it. It would look real small, but you could actually see it moving across the sky at night. And then I remember we started getting involved in the astronaut program. And I remember when it seemed like it took them forever to launch one. They'd get it all ready to go up, and they'd have maybe 4, 5, 6 delays on some of them launches, because they really didn't know what they were doing. Everything was playing it by ear. And and I remember when they let's see, what was his name? The Navy guy. He was the first guy. He just went up and down.
Oh, Shepard.
Shepard, yeah, Alan Shepard. And then there was a couple more that they launched like that before Glenn really went on his. What did he make? 3 orbits? Yeah, he made 3 orbits. And you ever? I don't know if you've ever been to the museum and seen the capsule. Man, them guys had little or no room in that thing. And then I remember how the next step they advanced to was the Mercury.
Mercury was the first one.
Mercury was the first one. Gemini was the second one. And then how many launches they had on that. And then they had one where one of the astronauts, Smith was it, I think, was the first man to go out outside the capsule.
First American was Ed White.
White, yeah. And he didn't go very far. He was on like a tether. And then they kept advancing with more launches. And I remember when Grissom and White, was it White and who was the 3? Grissom, I remember, was one of the 3. When they had the fire and
Chappie.
And Chappie, yeah. And I remember that. And then they had the one where the first guy said they didn't land, they just went around the moon and came back.
Uh-huh.
And
that was on Christmas Eve at Grandma's house.
Yeah. I remember that.
I remember that very well.
You remember that?
Grandma's house, coming out after Grandma's party, and
Yeah.
And they were on the radio, and they just burned out of orbit, in fact, I think, that night.
Yeah.
Right after the party.
67, when we had that big snowstorm.
Right.
And I did have, I don't know what happened to them. I had movies of Susan and her sister walking through the gangway where the snow was higher than them. Because you couldn't, that was when we had 24 inches of snow in just a little over 20 hours or something like that. And nobody was going hardly anywhere except I rode for over a couple of months. I rode to work on the bus because I couldn't get my car out of the garage there.
Blizzard of 67 because I got out of school for a couple days. Let's see, I remember when Martin Luther King was shot and they were burning the city of Chicago because my dad was worried about his mom who didn't live too far away from the area. So I remember him calling her and telling her to be careful.
Coming back again, and we were talking to Chris about the 60s, what was happening in the world in the 60s as she remembered it. Would you like to resume?
That's about all I can.
Kennedy's
remember.
assassination, the Vietnam War, nothing else.
That's about all I can think of.
Okay, Kathy, what do you remember about the 60s in the world?
I remember John F. Kennedy that day when he got shot. I also remember the Vietnam War, but I also remember when they landed on the moon in '69. That was kind of a neat kind of experience. You know, I'll never forget. That was in the summer, July.
Did you get to see it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, watched it on TV. You know, watched him take that first step for mankind.
What was happening in the world?
Well, without sounding repetitious,
Sure,
Vietnam, Woodstock,
Woodstock. Well, nobody's remembered that. Thank you.
all the great bands getting together and playing for, what was it, 3 days or something like that?
Did you remember when it was happening?
Yeah, I remember.
Oh, thank you.
I remember. Yeah, and that's, well, Kennedy, the fact that Kennedy was shot, that was a big thing a long time afterwards. That's about it.
World in the 60s that you remember?
I was somewhat shielded from a lot of that, but I still knew that there were the hippies, there were drugs, and you know, the war, that you know, the Vietnam War. I remember seeing that on the TV, but again, I was somewhat shielded from all the violence. I do remember the Kennedys being shot, and Martin Luther King is a turbulent period, of course. But again, as a child, I was somewhat sheltered from it. But I wasn't in a coma. I remember that.
The 60s, it was a up and down period, if I could say it in the correct term, because there was so much negative going on politically, you know, in our country. The assassination of Kennedy, it just, our country, it took our whole country an enormous amount of time to get over that. Everybody felt an emptiness feeling, whether you were a Kennedy person or not. It was just terrible. And then to have the assassination of the assassinator take place in jail soon afterward, just compounded this entire terrible situation. That showing it every day, several times a day, as what happened, I just compounded this terrible feeling throughout our country. And from that standpoint, it was not an enjoyable period there because of that. I mean, there was some enjoyment because of my children and other good things happening in our family, having our first home, but this assassination of Kennedy and the results of that were just a terrible feeling for people of our country.
Well put.